Good morning. Today I will be discussing or providing an education video on implementing the floating collections in the library. I performed personal interviews with two stringent managers in the library that play a great role in this implementation. The first person was Chris Dennis. He's the manager over communications, and Beth Walters, who's the manager over cataloging. The primary focus of implementing a floating collection in the library is simple. The process of determining the library's objective and strategies for distribution is an essential plan for cost efficiency. There is currently implementation and testing of distribution called the floating collections. This redistribution process manages and prints electronic collections. In addition to this distribution strategy, the library is planning to expand its digital presence and rely more on small kiosk locations. To make this strategy successful, they need to implement in areas where population is increasingly rapidly but spreads out over a large geographic expanse, making it difficult to build service points and will meet the demands of most customers. In the discussion, I will give a brief analysis on the effects of implementing the floating collections in the library. I've also mentioned that there will be personal interviews that I will go further in detail in their areas of expertise. Okay, now first, let's talk about information technologies for small businesses. The floating collection is one collection and one library system consideration. This process classifies library materials as floating and not on the shelves by material instead of returning them. And floating collections allow patrons to driven collection management where local interests drive where the collections reside. The hope is that implementing floating collection will reduce the financial burdens associated with transportation, their network, and the replacement of items in locations where demand is high. Now, let's discuss the distribution process. The stories told about how library materials would float from location to location systematically changes their locations information in the integrated library system that the library holds, entitled The Horizon, provided by Cersei Dynex. And the patrons access their materials and items through their online pack access, which is in short their OPAC. This type of material distribution decreases carrier costs since there is no need to return the items back to their home location. The floating collection distribution strategy has become a rewarding and best practices for the Fort Worth Library. With this distribution strategy, the ILS system presents a vigorous floating collection component. Now let's get into those components. Okay, first, the process of implementing the floating library collections is the art in itself. There are several important features needed to enforce for implementing the floating collections. The most important feature for implementing the library's floating collection is to modify these ILS to route library material accordingly, and that's from Beth Walters. The setup process is very involved itself. The first stage is configuring the system, including determining which collections will float and which locations will be excluded from the floating mix. The next stage will be the testing phase. Once it is testing the process of some of the items of each collection selected or not selected. A recording of the results also along with the document test plan is necessary. After modifying the system, according to Beth, the next important feature includes setting up specific rebalancing plans that predetermines various ways of handling redistribution of the library's material in advance. In this case, the library system utilizes the cataloging tool called Collection Assessment Tools, which in short is called a CATS. This evaluation tools creates the library collection management department that is later sent to various library units and units for redistribution of materials. Also, according to Beth, upon unit or library receipt of these tools, they are to use the CATS to evaluate the items in their collection for discard and reordering. Another component of implementing the floating collections is attributes to its ability of weeding. After the units, of the library runs its CATS tools, they need to weed items or discard them based on the tool. According to Beth, if the item is dirty, damaged, or it is required for reading or discarding. However, if the copies are popular in a particular lot at a library location, instead of weeding away for discard, librarians are advised to first ensure that the total number of physical copies that are in the system, and they try to determine if a branch could use it. Now, the final important feature of implementing a floating collection necessitates librarians from a particular location remembering that the items are no longer required to be sent back to its home location. It is to remain on their shelves. Once the libraries let the system work as configured, the process of floating is more understanding and less confusing. Now, let's briefly talk about the strengths and weaknesses of implementing this type of collection. Now, first, the strengths. There are many advantages in implementing floating collections in the library system. Some advantages include cutting the library's volume of delivering library's material while reducing staff time, processing time. Another advantage includes having the level increase of library material availability. Libraries implementing their floating collections will reduce the ergonomic strain while strengthening their material budgets. Another advantage would include accessing that more equitable by allowing more patrons control collection. Now, let's talk about some of the weaknesses. Where there's weaknesses, where there is advantages, there's always disadvantages. The first is some concerns are the lack of staff buy-in and the simple belief one method over another. When you implement new technology in a work environment, staff do feel threatened and they are resistant to change. There always seems to be a taste of doubt in their mind. So, another disadvantage includes the lack of guidelines and the less libraries being specialized locations. If they were known to be a location that had just particular items, then in this case, the items that they used to have are now floating to other locations, and their demand of their community is taking precedence over their specialty. Staff overcoming these issues can lead to floating collection success overall. Now, the next thing we will evaluate will be addressing effective communication. To address effective communication with the correct market segment, a plan of filling the reaction of patrons. Libraries should poll or survey patrons and get feedback. According to Chris Dennis, by monitoring the changes to shelves and delivery bins also provides effective communication measures. This analysis will ensure that in circulation figures. After performing a thorough data analysis, there should be a revision of the policy and procedures, along with sharing success stories with staff and customers in a important way of communication. Now, let me go to some strategy recommendations. Okay, there are several at the possible strategies to improve the overall marketing plan for implementing a floating collections. Before implementing this form of distribution strategies, there are several things to consider. The first thing to consider, there should be an analysis of the current collections to float. There should be meetings held where they can decide on a small collection for a test, to be a test pallet, and once that has become successful, then it should broaden to a larger collection where the demand is more in need. The next thing I would recommend is there should be a role established for the reading materials. When during the interview with Beth Walters, they already have an implementation plan for reading. If librarians or librarian managers follow suit with the recommended plan for reading, then there should be success. The next strategy, the library should consider determining which collection should flow by starting with the small collection as stated earlier. The next element to consider is building benchmarks and testing. My final recommendation for implementation should be to record the success stories. Now, to conclude this video, I would say that the floating collections is one of the collections in a one library system consideration, classifying library material as floating and not to buy shelving materials instead of returning them. The floating collection distribution strategy has become a rewarding best practices for libraries. The process of implementing the library floating collection is an art in itself. There are several important features needed to enforce the implementing floating collection. There are several advantages for implementing the floating collection in the library system, whereas there's also disadvantages. Libraries addressing an effective communication strategy for their patrons assist library administrators when implementing a strategy recommendation for success. Thank you for listening.